Good morning, sisters, associates, companions, and discerners. I add my sincere welcome to each of you as we begin this virtual gathering marking the 175th anniversary of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the deep roots we share with the Oblate Sisters of Providence. From the opening prayer, you can see the deliberate choice to form a bridge to the rich history we witnessed in 2005 at Immaculata's gathering, where Mother Lang and Mother Teresa first spoke to us from heaven. Sister Margaret Gannon, the historian from Scranton, wrote that original script, touching us all as the richness of the Oblates and the IHM were woven into a tapestry of grounded grace. It is this grounded grace which has continued to shape each one of us and the ministries we embrace as women and men who work among the people of God. The passionate voices of Mother Lang and Mother Teresa call us to look again at systemic racism and how it is operative in our lives individually and communally. And it is this grounded grace which continued to support us through the pandemic of 2020 as it forced the cancellation of our original Monroe travels, pointing us toward this new virtual event to a completely different place than we had started. It is nothing less than this grace and divine providence which has promoted our resilience, our ongoing witness, and our embrace of the next chapter and what it holds for us in contemplation and action. I'd like to introduce our presenter for this next 2 days. Part of this grounded grace is Janine Hill Fletcher, a professor of theology at Fordham University, where she walks with colleagues and students as a constructive theologian. Her research is at the intersection of Christian systematic theology and issues of diversity, including gender, race, and religious diversity. In addition to her teaching, Janine is a board member of the grassroots social justice organization, the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, an intergenerational, multiracial, and multi-religious group organizing to address social justice issues in New York City and beyond. As a prolific writer, Janine has published most recently with Fordham, Maryknoll, and Continuum Publishers. Consistent contributions from Janine to academic journals and many workshop presentations include the topics of racial diversity, interfaith studies, interreligious dialogue, and what it means to put tradition into practice. Notable for all of us as we explore the next chapter of our rich history is Janine's own highlight of her formative years and the providential ties to IHM history, as her own three sisters are alumna of the former Immaculate Heart High School in Westchester, Illinois. Janine herself taught in the gap year between her Jesuit Corps volunteer year and her graduate studies at Harvard Divinity School. We are grateful that her busy professional calendar has allowed her to join us this weekend. She reminds us that we are rooted in our history and in God's salvation history, and that what we do each and every single day deepens our roots in both. As these days unfold, we invite you to listen deeply to the Holy Spirit and take hold of the challenge to move forward. Listen to your heart as the sessions unfold. Listen to the hearts of those with whom you dialogue in small groups. Listen to the message of Janine Hill Fletcher, one of our contributing voices. It is full, the weekend is full, and our hope is that together we hear the Spirit's invitation to the next chapter.
We're gathering over the next few days to celebrate the faith-filled lives of 192 years of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and nearly 176 years of the Sisters Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. You've celebrated significant anniversaries before, as this page from the archive celebrating 101 years of the Oblate Sisters shows us, and you continue to be guided by your histories as each congregation tells your story of who you are, rooted in these founding moments. Joined together, we see an expanded reach of ministries with shared roots and extended branches across time and place. You've come together from different locations by the remarkable technology that keeps us connected during the most challenging time of our pandemic. Mother Mary Lang and Mother Teresa Maxis have opened our time together with an imaginative view from heaven that places their history and yours in the long view and rises up to look at this history from the perspective of why it matters. In their estimation, you're continuing the work of healing the world and struggling for justice, educating for compassion and journeying toward wholeness through education, healthcare, advocacy, accompaniment, and more. They ask us to think about how our work is rooted in history. Consider for just a moment that there are different ways of narrating our common history. Take, for example, this image, narrated by entrepreneurs in business who chart the development of social relationships toward the innovations of an increasing gross world product. Or this image from NASA that places human history in a tiny portion of this small box in the pictorial representation of the universe as a whole. The Earth and planetary scientists remind us of the small sliver of human history pictured on this chart, situated in the broader scale of life history, Earth history, and cosmic history. You see in this image that very small sliver of human history, whose thickness is greatly exaggerated over and against the much greater expanse of cosmic history. In both time and space, we are small compared to the great expanse of cosmic history. And yet, history told from any human perspective will expand the complexity and importance of human history exponentially, as this representation of the golden age of Islamic culture demonstrates. A single moment in time and space can expand to fill our horizon as we marvel at the great possibilities and real challenges of being human. As Teresa and Mary narrate this history, we might pause to consider why this history matters from a theological perspective, and we might bend our ears to the words of Gustavo Gutierrez, who takes a similarly long, broad, and theological view to contemplate history, all of human history, as part of God's history. Gutierrez reads history through the lens of the Bible to see that the work of the Creator, expressed in Genesis, is the work of a salvific ordering from out of chaos that continues in the salvation of the Exodus event, is given voice in the expression of the prophets, and extends with a through line to the liberating work of Christ that continues in the human project that he made manifest. In Gutierrez's vision, this history that is ours is God's history. In his words, there are not two histories, one sacred and one profane. Rather, there is only one human destiny, The history of salvation is the very heart of human history. A Christian view of history is told in a Trinitarian key, that the God of life created from out of nothingness and chaos the possibilities for human flourishing, that humanity, both inestimably precious and unfailingly flawed, is called to be an expression of God's life, and that Christians, drawn by the witness of Jesus of Nazareth and propelled by the Spirit of God's providence, continue in each era the struggle to make that theological reality a human reality. Viewing our world and its history through a Christian lens, Elizabeth Johnson asks us to see that our lives are made possible by the Creator's Spirit, and that the presence and activity of God pervade the world. From the most intricate sights of the natural world to our most expansive imaginings of our universe, the presence and activity of God pervade the world, and we are called to be co-creators of that divine life, embracing care for the natural world and all that is within it. What does it look like for us to take the theological perspectives of Elizabeth Johnson and Gustavo Gutierrez seriously? And what is our call if we're grounded in a Catholic theological commitment like that of Karl Rahner's, who insists that humans have a distinctive role to play in this one salvation history? For Rahner, the central theological commitment of the Christian tradition was an irreversible, undeniable intimacy between the human and the divine, made visible in the incarnation of Jesus, but made possible then as a witness to what we too are called to become. Deep in our own nature, God dwells, Rahner prayed, and he theologized that the incarnation was the most basic datum of human existence, from which all of the Christian faith emerged. Really and radically, he wrote, every person must be understood as the event of a supernatural self-communication of God. Rahner also concluded, and I quote, as God's real self-communication and grace, therefore, the history of salvation and revelation is coexistent and coextensive with the history of the world and the human spirit. Of course, human history is riddled with our incontrovertible failures to be what we were created to be. And in a sense, that's why the work of the Oblate Sisters and the IHM Sisters has been so necessary all the way through these nearly 200 years. While the Church has firmly expressed that humanity forms one community and grounds its commitment in the biblical witness that all humanity was made in the image of God, our history is one that fails to live up to this vision and this commitment. And so we are called in history by God to the witness of Christ for the flourishing of all. This theological vision and the deep spiritual commitment that accompanies it is the foundation on which we both celebrate and lament the histories in which the Oblate Sisters and the IHM Sisters are found. Because the preciousness of life has also at every turn been under threat, with both natural causes and human causes. From cholera to COVID, the sisters have struggled. Alongside immigrants in the 21st century and those at the border today, the sisters have struggled. In the classrooms and in the halls of Congress, sisters have struggled. They have struggled to pursue that vision of human flourishing that is a particular inflection of the Catholic Christian tradition. The sisters anticipated and continue the work that was articulated by the Catholic tradition at Vatican II. The tradition's Catholic social teaching summed up in this segment from Gaudium et Spes, that there must be made available to all persons everything necessary for leading a life truly human, such as food, clothing, and shelter, the right to choose a state of life freely, and to found a family, the right to education, to employment, to a good reputation, to respect, to appropriate information, to activity in accord with the upright norms of one's conscience, to protection of privacy, and to rightful freedom in matters religious too. Reading the signs of the times in the light of the gospel and guided by providence, the sisters have struggled to make God's flourishing a reality for all those whose lives they have touched. In our time together over the next 2 days, we're going to hold together these threads of the discussion: the historical, the theological, the spiritual. And we're going to hone in on one particular aspect of the struggle that has become absolutely crucial in our day: the struggle for racial justice. That this struggle continues demonstrates as clearly as anything else the deep failures of humanity, the deep failures even of Christians to live up to and to live out the call of Christ, the good news of the gospel. But this history of struggle also reveals a God who accompanies us. In the words of Katie Cannon, God's freely given gift of grace enables us to resist the forces of death and degradation arrayed against us, and to affirm our dignity as beloved persons created in the image of God. We might think of grace as God's indwelling spirit providing, in the words of Charles Long, and I quote, a new power of being, a power that would sustain our being because the powers that be would not sustain them, end quote. Grace and God's presence in this framing is the power to hold together your personhood in the face of powers bent on destroying it. And so, it is God and God's history and God's providence that accompanies us in this long struggle for racial justice. Shawn Copeland reminds us in a new way that reading the signs of the times must include not only the joys of our humanity, but the threats to it. And our facing those threats with the witness of the crucified one is what we're called to do. As Copeland describes, we cannot but find ourselves standing in a crucified world. She writes, and I quote, if we would follow Christ crucified with attention, reverence, and devotion, we would recognize that the tears and bloods and moans of the innocent have been absorbed into the air we breathe, have seeped into our streams and rivers, into the earth in which we plant and from which we harvest and eat. In this world of pain and suffering, we are called even today to be followers of Jesus, and Copeland reminds us, and I quote her, we who would be his disciples discover our humanity, our personhood in imitation of him, in taking up our cross in order to transform evil into good. And so in our times, we might see ourselves taking up the cross of our struggle alongside those in our nation who struggle for racial justice, and those who strive for a more just world, those who struggle to finally transform the evil of our racial project that has been a threat to human life since the founding of this nation. Guided by the theological vision of God's care for all creation and humanity within it, the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters, servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, have been living witnesses to the possibilities of living faithfully the value of respect for all people. And your stories will help us to see the real challenges of doing this work in the light of the weight of racial injustice that has been the arc of our American story, in which your histories are found. And so together, in the sessions that follow, we might ask, how has the U.S. Racial Project made it challenging to live the value of respect for all people? As we're making our way into this work, I've asked us to think historically, theologically, and spiritually. And now I want to ensure that we're starting on the same page, theoretically. Over the next 2 days, I'll introduce some key theoretical frames and some terminology with which we can think about history in a particular way. It's my hope that in the course of these sessions, the theoretical framing will be clear enough for us to think collectively through the lens that I'm offering, to increase our ability to think critically about the history we're examining, and to increase our ability to think together with the same theoretical frame and similar vocabulary to structure our conversations. with some key terminology will join the conversation in progress in our nation from out of the many different places that we're coming. And I hope that we leave with a new set of vocabulary to continue this work together. So I want to start with some further clarification in order to consider deeply this question of how the U.S. Racial Project has made it challenging to live the value of respect for all people. I'm using the term racial project, following sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Wynant. As contemporary scholars, Omi and Wynant suggest that when we're thinking about racism and about race as a strand of our history, it's not helpful to think about race as something embedded in biology or just passed down through culture. It's more helpful, they propose, to think about race as a human project of categorization. At any given time, the categories of the races are put forward as imaginative divisions for sorting the human family. In our early modern period, it was botanists and philosophers who were imagining the categories of the races, and scholars propose that this happened embedded in a particular moment of our social, political, and economic development in the era of European exploration and expansion. In the era of colonialism, when European explorers and merchants sought to capitalize on newly discovered lands and control newly encountered people. Back in Europe, botanists and philosophers were imagining the human differences of the peoples and cultures that the explorers had newly discovered. They proposed differences among the human family based on geography or climate or food habits. The philosophers and botanists used linguistic differences to divide the human family, and the phenotypical and physiological differences that they saw were used to support their claims about the fundamental differences across the human family. These philosophers and thinkers and botanists and physicians organized the fundamental differences that they imagined into the same types of categories that they were using to organize plants and the animal kingdom, such as this slide shows. And as we see in the categories developed on this slide, these thinkers debated and disagreed as to how many races were needed to organize the whole of the human family. What Omi and Wynant ask us to see is not only that these categories were imagined, but also that when people were sorted into these categories, the categorizations became a criteria for distributing or withholding material and social benefits. As a project of colonialism, the early modern racial project held life and death meanings if one was categorized as Mongoloid, Xanthocroid, or Negroid. The unusual namings that we see on this chart should remind us of the imagination and construction involved in these categories. But placing these categories within the broader system of colonialism, they might also remind us how these categories of the races mapped on to contemporary categories that we use, like Asian, Caucasian, and Black, and should remind us of the devastating effects that these imagined categories had from the perspective of those who were the victors and the victims of European global expansion. So for Omi and Wynant, the racial project that began in the US in this era that comes out of modern European colonialism had three distinct and interrelated features. And we can see these three distinct features in the past and look for these same distinct features in our present when we're thinking about racial projects. These three distinct moments are these. In any given racial project, the categories are imaginatively constructed. Then people are sorted into those categories, and in the third step, benefits are distributed or withheld on the basis of the category into which one has been sorted. The modern racial project that is our heritage was formed in a particular moment in history, with theorists positing that it was precisely the economic and political project of colonialism that gave rise to the distinctive ways that we have come to think about race. Situating our U.S. history in a broader European history, we remember that Europeans did not always know the rich diversity of the human family, but came to know that diversity and organize that diversity in a particular way through the project of exploration, expansion, and colonization. Fueled by the project of European colonialism, the categorization of the races served divisive and exploitative ends. This is the long view of our inheritance of racial categorizations and racial categories. But scientists and scholars today believe that these early attempts to categorize the human family on the basis of geography or language or food habits or climate or religion, these original organizations of the human family, today's scholars see as fundamentally flawed. Mapping human genomes now, scientists can see a few things. First, that the genetic similarities among humanity across the categorizations that have been constructed as the races far outweigh the differences. As scientists describe, there is as much or more diversity and genetic difference within any racial group as there is between people of different racial groups. The genetic differences that might be related to climate or phenotype now reflect a global mixing of persons, as we've been in dynamic movement across the face of the earth for generations. The documentary series Race, The Power of an Illusion, helps us to see more clearly the ways our preconceptions about race might be investigated in order to begin anew to address race and racial injustice. Instead of simply adopting the predetermined categories we inherit from 18th century botanists, sociologists propose that we think about race as a series of categorizations that emerge from particular times and places and emerge from the material conditions and political struggles of those times and places. For Omi and Wynant, then, race is an unstable and decentered complex of social meanings constantly being transformed by political struggle. Race is a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. And these categories and concepts then become systems through which benefits are withheld or granted on the basis of this imagined racial categorization. It is precisely the material, social, and political realities in which race has functioned as categories that divide, that the power of this illusion of race, is necessary to reckon with. Because while we are genetically similar, we have become socially differentiated and statistically divided by race. It's that history and our embeddedness within it and the possibilities of mobilizing repair that our look at Teresa Maxis and Mary Lang will aim to unpack. So we share a theological history, one that is rooted in a Christian vision that the Creator of all desires the well-being of all creation. Guided by the person of Christ and drawn by God's providence, the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary share the commitment to lives of living faithfully the call of the gospel and the value of respect for all people. But the signs of our times remind us of the failure of our nation to live out this call in light of the continued racial injustice that we can see in our historical moment. How did the illusory and imaginative divisions among the human family create the realities we encounter today? Realities in which the differences of race map onto the differences of human well-being. How did those illusory categories create the realities of division we experience today? Division and disparity in health outcomes. Division and disparity in relation to access to education. Division and disparity in relation to our neighborhoods and access to home ownership. The illusory categories of the races have been used to provide well-being for some and withhold well-being for others. In health, in education, in home ownership, and in other forms of wealth building. If race is an illusion, how do we see clearly the real impacts of this illusion on material outcomes, evidenced starkly in this image of our nation's racial wealth gap, where the median wealth of white families is 16 times greater than that of Black and Latinx families? In the next several sessions, we'll explore some of the ways in which past racism is responsible for the realities of educational, health, and wealth disparities that we encounter today. And I'll draw attention to at least two different forms of racism that we'll want to use as our touchstones for thinking about how these imaginative categories have created these disparities that we encounter today. The two forms of racism that I'll ask us to think about are forms that are interpersonal and institutional. In a short essay that you can access by Googling the title that you see below, Camara Phyllis Jones's Levels of Racism, in this short essay, you can easily access the different forms of racism that she puts forward, and I'm following her here, asking us to think about not only the kinds of racism that we might see in the world, where racism is defined as prejudice and discrimination, and we can see the actions that are personally mediated. We also want to think about and analyze and look for the forms of racism that have become institutionalized, the forms of racism that are invisible to us, but that is defined as differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. It's this form of racism that's embedded in the systems and structures of today that have a bias against and a privilege towards certain categories of racial groupings. So to be responsive to the call of the gospel in our day, we're required to address not only the personally mediated racism that we can see, but also the institutionalized racism that sometimes we have not been able to see. In our next session, we'll unpack further what it means to be attentive to those two forms of racism. The challenge of today is to read the signs of our times in the light of the gospel, to try to see clearly the realities of injustice, and to be the hands and hearts of transformation toward justice. We'll spend our time revisiting the histories of Mother Mary Lang and Mother Teresa Maxis and the history of our nation's racial projects that their histories and ours are situated within. It's the hope that by understanding our history, where we have come from in a history of racial injustice, that will move more confidently into a future of racial justice, guided by providence and committing ourselves again to be the co-creators of the one history that is God's history.